Hey, happy Friday. As usual, it is time to discuss a book. There are no surprises here because you saw the thumbnail. We're talking about Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea by Rita Chang-Eppig, and this is either going to be a shorter than usual, succinct exploration, or I'm going to blather on, so about the usual. But this is a literary fiction historical pirate novel, and the beginning of the book thrusts us right into the action with our heroine Sekyun watching her husband fall in the midst of battle. And through this, we both chart her life up to this moment and how she became part of the helm of a pirate fleet and the head of a pirate alliance in China, but then also watch her and the successor of this fleet, because it does not go automatically to her sons, as they navigate what this is going to look like and the transfer of power after her husband falls. And especially this idea of this transfer of power and this idea of transition as China is kind of facing a transition in power. We are watching the government come after the pirate fleets, but we are also watching Europe encroaching on this territory and kind of maneuvering around the pirate fleets as well, and the political alliances that rise out of that, both in predominantly England's kind of encroaching on China as a trade partner, and then primarily also looking at the Portuguese, I believe, and the Dutch in this area. Now, admittedly, my history and my knowledge of trade, historical trade, is not what it should be based on high school world history, but I also appreciated the way that this book explored the history of things, and it definitely felt like a historical fiction novel with that adventure twist, but it still was with that very literary fiction voice in a way, because as you can see, it's not a very thick novel, but we span a bunch of time, and it's very readable, but at the same time, it wasn't something that I just kind of sped through either. So I really loved the way this narrative wove in and out of itself, and one of the ways it did this was threading an exploration of a particular deity or goddess throughout, and using this goddess as a framing device to kind of explore Sekyun's history and life, but then also using her as a framing device in some ways to explore Sekyun's kind of philosophy about life. And this philosophy definitely grows out of Sekyun's past, especially in her kind of early losses, and we see her kind of meet up with her husband that is lost at the beginning of the book on the flower boats, and she refers to the flower boats. And even before being formally introduced to what the flower boats are, they are basically what it sounds like they would be. And so Sekyun is really primed to expect the worst in a lot of ways. She doesn't trust in happiness, she doesn't trust in good fortune, she is always kind of scheming, and that's one of the reasons that she was brought into this fleet in the first place, is her ability to think on her feet and strategize, and her being a real asset for her brain, and seeing the way that she positions other people, other women especially, into roles of power in some ways within this fleet, and the ways that she's appreciated, but still exploring how her gender plays into things. But to go back to her worldview for a second, and granted, again, I don't know the world history here nearly as well as I should, and I don't know the kind of theological and philosophical kind of undertones to everything here nearly as well as I should, but we are within this world where there is a lot of lack. We really are exploring the have and have-nots, this idea of the emperor holding all this control, trying to quash rebellions, and ruling under this mandate of heaven while people are starving in villages, and the way that we see the kind of ebb and flows of these pirate fleets as people will kind of join up for a season when there is famine, and the way that the pirates are kind of serving the people in some ways, but are also raiding the people when the people aren't serving them. So it's very interesting, and this political landscape definitely plays into Sekyun's point of view. And so from the beginning of the book, we are watching a woman kind of strategizing to maintain her power and to consolidate her power in some ways, because she enters into a second marriage with the successor to the fleet in order to consolidate this power and basically continue on a similar arrangement. Now, this means that within the context of their relationship and the terms they've set up for this partnership, for this marriage, that she has to at least try to conceive a son for this new husband. And the way this book looks at motherhood is very interesting because Sekyun, by normal standards, would not be considered a good mother, probably. She doesn't really spend time with her sons. They are left with their father's family early in the novel, and it really explores this idea of women being expected to bear children in a lot of ways, and also the idea that men really have no concept of what this means for a woman. Sekyun does not or has not had easy pregnancies for any of her children, and there is a lot of risk and fear wrapped up in that. There is a lot kind of out of her control in terms of the circumstances in a way that a woman who likes to be in control, that's not comfortable. It's already an uncomfortable situation. That does not help. And so it's interesting because it really is exploring this idea of bearing children as a kind of chess piece in a way. And we see that idea somewhat complicated with her last pregnancy, but it also really does acknowledge the risks, especially of the last pregnancy. Because if I was reading the context clues of her age correctly, she was probably 32, 34 by the time she was pregnant in the book. Now, to be fair, this book spans a little over 2 years from that initial inciting incident of her husband being cut down in this fight. And it was oftentimes a little hard to follow the timeline because we are jumping around. We're not going to stay on the ship and document the entire travel time between like meeting up with this person who is part of this alliance, or, you know, going to this base or this fight, whatever. We do see the fights and we see the alliances most particularly. And we also see the unrest, especially within the alliance of these fleets, set up pretty early because at first it's a matter of consolidating this power, maintaining the alliance. But from the moment that they've kind of reconfigured what this is going to look like, they're like, okay, we're going to take over and basically run it about the same. We are still going to hold this power here, making sure everyone else is on board. But from that initial kind of feeling out of everyone else, we find out that one of the members of the alliance is missing. There had been a storm in the area that they were known to kind of patrol. We don't know if that has anything to do with it. But there are also these rumblings of an emperor's man kind of on the hunt for pirates. This idea that the emperor has set his sights on quashing these pirates. We skip the time in between these things. We get a sense, especially for some of the main alliances that they have, and the way that it's kind of tenuous. We do have these rich histories with both of these other pirates that we're in contact with, and the way that it explores the complexities of some of these relationships, I think is actually really subtle because a lot of these characters are dealing with some pretty intense trauma, but they're obviously not going to articulate it in that way based on the historical context. That leads to some of Sekyun's real anger and resentment when she sees people interacting with the world in a way that implies like a kind of hope for the future. She specifically calls out people who have hope for the future in many parts, while at the same time trying to lay a future for the people she cares about without, I don't think, fully realizing it. And there's a real complexity to her because she is neither fully hero or fully villain, because she does some things that are really ruthless, but at the same time, she also really tries to do right by her people or those she considers her people. At the same time, the minute you cross her, it's over. And there is this kind of ruthlessness to this world and this lifestyle because anyone could be a spy, basically, and that's part of the plotting as well. Now, because of the nature of the time jumps, it can be hard sometimes to follow some of that tension, but it feels like a lot of that is a little bit more intellectual. It's a little bit like higher level philosophical in some ways, and this idea of how these characters are interacting with their world, specifically Sekyun, and the way that she is seeing her own position in the world and the way that she is seeing fate position her in the world. And this is why we position her at such a moment of change, both in her personal life and then the wider world, because she is making decisions for herself based on the world as it has been operating and how she has been operating within it. But the world is changing. It very much feels like it's taking place in the same historical landscape as Babel and the Poppy War. I say feels like instead of is because This is not my historical expertise, and I could be very off, but I really do appreciate the historical angle here. It feels so vibrant, but it also takes a look at the kind of idea of freedom on the sea and all of the opportunities that Seokyeon has to kind of live an existence outside of traditional expectations and the power she is able to grasp. And this is part of the real multifaceted exploration of her as a character that is mirrored in this exploration of this goddess, this idea that stories create new realities and that there are so many different angles to a story or versions of a story, and that one entity can exist and be remembered in such a myriad of different ways. So it really is looking at this idea of this kind of moment of change, but also all of the different ways that can be perceived, and this kind of eye of history in some ways, and also this kind of like battling philosophy, especially as we see Seokyeon kind of spar with the emperor's men and the kind of philosophy there, and what moral or good action is within this world where so many want for so much, and where we can see the outside world really pushing in, and how they're pushing in a way that will be ultimately harmful for people. And so there's a lot going on in this novel, and at times it can feel a little off kilter because the pirate angle is so compelling and is obviously such a big part of things that it can be easy to want to focus on the kind of adventure part of this, which we definitely get. There are still battles at sea. There's still a lot of all of that, but at its heart, I think it is much more this exploration of this woman amidst all of this change. Editing me breaking in briefly just because my high school English teacher would surely be ashamed of me if I failed to mention or explore the idea of water and the sea, and also Seokyeon's pregnancy in relation to this exploration of rebirth and change, and the way that both of those things are symbolic for change or a new start, a new beginning, rebirth, what have you. And so we do have this really action-focused narrative in a lot of ways, but again, we still have a voice and a style that are really forwarding a lot of more literary kind of explorations and a lot of symbolism there that may be missed on the first kind of pass through if we're focusing on the kind of political plotting and intrigue and the action, but is definitely there when sitting back and going, oh, wait a minute. So this is my, oh, wait a minute moment. So it's adventurous, compelling, and forward moving, but at the same time, it might be a little bit denser and philosophical and reflective than you may go in expecting from a pirate book. And I think the way that it balances both of those things is really interesting. It provides this real stark contrast of the violence with the reflective in a way that I think is really compelling and I really enjoyed in the book. I thought the voice of this was really excellent. So yeah, as you can probably hear in my voice, I'm not feeling 100% right now. So hopefully I got at something somewhat insightful here, but thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Let me know yours if you've read this. I think that there is a lot to dive into. I think that there's a lot to dig into and converse about. I think it would make a great book club book because it does have that mix of the adventurous and the really kind of philosophical. So let me know what you're thinking. Like, subscribe, you know, whatever you're feeling in the moment. Read something good, and yeah, bye.